Atëherë mund të fillojmë fillimisht për të shpjeguar pak mbi aktivitetin. Është një projekt I cili ka prej një viti e gjysmë I cili po zbatohet midis Lëvizjes Europiane në Shqipëri dhe ELIAMEP, partnerëve tanë në Greqi, cilët janë një think tank I njohur, me reputacion sidomos fushën e Integrimit Europian, por dhe për sa I takon çështjeve ballkanike, për analizën e tyre, specifika ndryshme, po ashtu dhe sondazhe apo policy paper më të detajuar, të cilat ne kemi përfshirë gjatë këtij projekti. Jemi përpjekur që gjatë pjesës studimore të këtij projekti të analizojmë aspekte ndryshme të procesit integrimit Europian, të Shqipërisë, të Rumanisë, Bullgarisë si dy shembuj të suksesshëm të zgjerimit, por dhe më të fundit ku kemi ngjashmëri dhe mund të shohim se cilat janë ato ngjashmëri, si dhe sigurisht Greqisë, duke e lidhur më shumë me aspektet e krizës ekonomike, çfarë solli në procesin e integrimit midis institucionave, duke ditur që është një vend I Bashkimit Europian, po çfarë solli pikërisht në politikat europiane që ato zbatojnë. Kjo është seria e parë e aktiviteteve që do nisim, pra gjatë gjithë korrikut do kemi folës të ndryshme dhe do ju dërgojmë më vonë me email listën e temave dhe folësve për gjatë gjithë korrikut, ku do keni mundësi për të ndjekur ato panele të cilat ju mendoni se keni interes. Gjithashtu, sipas agjendës do shihni që dhe kolegët e Lëvizjes Europiane organizatës kanë përgatitur disa prezantime që ne do t'i bëjmë hap pas hapi gjatë gjithë këtyre leksioneve, 11 leksioneve, 12 me gjithë leksionin final, ku do jetë në formë konference, ku do mundemi për të analizuar më shumë për procesin e integrimit të Shqipërisë, procesin e integrimit të Rumanisë dhe Bullgarisë, si dhe aspektet ekonomike të krizës në Greqi. Në fund do të shpërndajmë dhe paperat, pra gjithë materialin studimor, si dhe surveyin e bërë, e cila mund të jetë me interes për ju. Sigurisht gjatë këtij diskutimi jeni të lirë për të bërë pyetje, do të sugjeronim për të përdorur chatin, por gjithashtu edhe me audio, nuk është problem. I kemi ndarë pjesët pikërisht për dhënë më shumë mundësi për diskutim mbas prezantimit të zotit Dimitar Bechev, më pas të kemi prezantimet tona dhe në të dy pjesët kanë mundësi për pyetje, për komente apo dhe diskutime të cilat ju I shihni me interes. Në momentin që do marr informacionin që zoti Bechev është online, në 3:20 presim që zoti Bechev të hyjë dhe të fillojë prezantimin e tij, po sigurisht që ndërkohë ne mundet që të vazhdojmë në rast se keni ndonjë pyetje të momentit për sa I takon aktivitetit apo aktivitetet në vazhdim, jeni të lirë ta bëni. Atëherë në qoftë se s'ka, unë do të pyes pak e shoh që është online. Në një sekondë sa të komunikojmë. Mr. Bechev, are you ready for...
Yes, I am. Hi, everyone.
Okay, hi, welcome, and thank you for participating in this webinar. And also thank you for your research and your paper on the examples of Romania and Bulgaria. I was just explaining before that at the end of all this series of webinars, we are going to disseminate in both Albanian and English all the research done through this project and your paper on the experiences of Romania and Bulgaria in the accession process. It is very important for us, the experience, especially because we share many similarities with Romania and Bulgaria. And although the Europe has changed and is changing continuously, but we have a lot of homeworks that we are going to do, and we are going more or less in the same path that Romania and Bulgaria has gone before. So, of course, it is important to know what are the challenges, what mistakes we should avoid to remake, and what are the successful stories. The floor is yours, please.
How many minutes do you want me to speak just before I start? What is the order of?
As you wish. Let's say we have less than an hour to have for the presentation and discussion, so it's up to you.
Okay, all right, okay. So what I want to do, and first of all, thanks to the European movement in Albania for the kind invitation. It's been a pleasure to contribute to this project. It made me go back to some of my earlier research and take stock of what happened. And it's really interesting now from the vantage point of today to come back to the events and processes in the 90s, in the early 2000s, and cast them against the backdrop of today. So what I wanted to do here is just to go through my paper and give you some of the main highlights and conclusions / takeaways. And maybe in the questions and answers, we can also reflect on how these are relevant or not to the experience of Albania and the rest of the Western Balkans. Though, as many of you know, Albania is kind of sits oddly in the Western Balkans. It's not a post-Yugoslav republic. It has its own issues, its own problems, and sometimes people working on the region kind of overlook Albania. So I think it's a very good idea to get to other countries in the east of Southeast Europe, Romania and Bulgaria, and juxtapose those experiences. In other words, to draw on a broader set of examples, not just on the post-Yugoslav set. So what I want to do is just go first through the various parts of the paper. Firstly, it starts with kind of a historical account where what were the main stages in this process? How did the EU set up its conditions, enforce the conditions, monitor, and what went fine and what didn't? Then I want to take a step back and from, again, the vantage point of today, given where Romania and Bulgaria are, to ask the question, why did some issue areas perform better? In other words, the EU conditions had better reception, produced more positive outcomes in both politics and the economy of the countries at hand, and why in other areas Romania and Bulgaria have become a byword for a missed opportunity. And ultimately what, in my view, of course, are the reasons to that. And one thing about Romania and Bulgaria now, and finally I'll go to the lessons learned at the very last section of the paper, which kind of opens it to discussion and makes allows for a nice bridge to the Albanian experience, I guess. If you look at any website or publication dealing with European affairs these days, Romania and Bulgaria are kind of absent. 10 years ago, they were the bad kids of European integration because they failed to democratize, failed to enforce the rule of law. That was the narrative. And they kind of stood out from the rest of Central and Eastern Europe.
Dhe në fakt ato kanë bërë dallimin me pjesën tjetër të Evropës qendrore dhe lindore. Më dëgjoni ndërhyjtë kanali kryesor?
Po, më duket është kanali kryesor.
Is there a problem with
E bëj konsekutiv apo?
Yeah, një sekond. We are just we have an issue with the translation. Let me just ask in the chat.
Okay.
Okay, please continue. Then when we have question, then we translate.
Sure.
Simultaneously.
Feel free to jump up and to interrupt me if there are questions. It's supposed to be an interactive session.
Okay, because we cannot do it simultaneously. We have some technical problems. We could not find the second channel. That's why. That's
understood. So these days, who are the bad kids in the region? First of all, Hungary, and second, even more importantly, Poland. So that has shifted attention away from what happened in Bulgaria, Romania, and put the spotlight on other countries that were perceived for much of those 20 years in the 1990s and the 2000s as the best performers of this process of internal democratization, market transition, and Europeanization. Now it looks as if Bulgaria and Romania are not the exception, but rather they set a pattern. But the other side of the coin is that there is not much attention paid to those two. They have slipped to the sidelines because EU is much more concerned about those core Eastern European countries, and there are reasons to be concerned for sure, because if you look at any democratic indices by international watchdogs, being Freedom House, Reporters Without Borders, the Bertelsmann Transformation Index, those two are not doing very well. And Bulgaria, sadly, the country I come from originally, is the worst performer. Romania has improved, for example, on Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, but Bulgaria has gone down. Bulgaria has backslid on media freedom to the unenviable 111th place when it comes to media. And again, this is an area where the EU was not very active. There was no conditionality. It was beyond view of the EU negotiation process. But as all of you know, in any young democracy, in a non-consolidated democracy, or for that matter, in any democratic system anywhere in the world, media play a crucial role in terms of maintaining or sustaining accountability and allowing for the rule, but also civic participation and enforcing transparency in policy making. And that is not the case in Bulgaria. We have a case of oligarchy capture of the media market with all the attendant negative consequences for democratic governance. One symptom of the democratic malaise in those two countries.
Mendoj që një prej simptomave të le themi.
So civic protest has become much more regularized because there's this feeling that the political system is not responding to the priorities of segments of the population. It's captured by special interests. So extra-institutional channels of political participation have become much more important as a means to push for accountability and for the rule of law. In Bulgaria, there was a big wave of demonstrations in 2013, 2014, but sporadic outbursts are very common. The same in Romania over the past period of 2 or 3 years, starting 2017. So there's this frustration, as anywhere else, with the lack of transparency in institutions and corruption in high places. Now, when the EU accepted those 2 countries, and I'll go back in greater detail later in my talk, there was the so-called cooperation verification mechanism, which was a way of saying those 2 have joined, but they haven't done enough, so we need to continue monitoring and implementing conditionality after membership, especially in the judicial sphere with unfinished judicial reform. But now, 13 years later, everyone, I think, agrees that CVM, the mechanism, hasn't done a good job. In other words, political elites and the main stakeholders are not taking it seriously because there is no sanctioning mechanism. And on the other hand, Brussels keeps it there because it's there already, and has not really considered, except maybe for Romania, to terminate the mechanism, because they don't know what to do if there is no mechanism. But that's not to say that the mechanism is delivering the goods. So it's become a fact of life. When Croatia joined in 2013, there was no such mechanism, just as a footnote. So this is the first part of the introduction. But what I want to also say in the paper is that it's too simplistic just to say that it was a mistake to accept those 2 countries. Our enlargement was a flawed experiment, and a game over. You should stop enlarging because it's because the democratization ambition, the Europeanization ambition, is not working. The picture is much more complex in some areas. Actually, it has done tremendous work. One area certainly is the economy. The 2 countries' economies have been transformed for the better by integration into the European Union. They are now way beyond the GDP they used to have in the early 90s, if 1989 as a threshold year. And the quality of the economy has changed dramatically. That's as well the case. The type of products, the export structure, so on and so forth. That's one gain. And the second gain, and I think it's much more clear in the case, is that EU experience has empowered some segment of the judiciary which have delivered accountability, with a number of politicians and high-ranking business people facing criminal justice, including party leaders and former prime ministers. And that's not the case in Bulgaria. Later on, I'll go into the details why those 2 have diverged, because we often tend to look at Romania and Bulgaria as a package. But in fact, when it comes to the rule of law, they followed very different trajectories. So let's now look at the 1990s. What happened then in this crucial period? Essentially, you had 2 countries that started from a very low point. Again, going back to Poland, to Hungary, those countries in Central Europe were much closer to the West, had denser contacts with Western European countries and the then European Economic Community. For instance, when the EU, or the future EU, started its assistance program, the FAR, it was intended expressly for Poland and Hungary as front runners in reform. Soon, actually, we marked the 31st anniversary of the first semi-free election in Poland, and that was in the summer of '89, way before the Berlin Wall fell. Many of you probably don't remember it because it was a long time ago. Some of you do remember it. But just to give you some flavor of the gap in the former communist bloc. at the time. So Romania and Bulgaria were much behind, much more isolated, and they were prevented from establishing institutional links with the EU or the European Economic Community at the time for political reasons. First of all, they were not committed to the kind of reformist policies that were rewarded at the time in Hungary and Poland. They had a problem with a substantial part of the population. The Ceausescu regime stood out in comparison to pretty much everyone else in Eastern Europe in terms of repression, and including the Hungarian minority. And even worse in Bulgaria, where we had a wave of ethnic cleansing in the summer of '89, when 300,000 of Bulgarian Turks were expelled from the country. So faced with these political circumstances, it was very difficult, impossible for the EU to extend trade cooperation, financial cooperation in these early days. So we are in 89, 90, the crucial time the Berlin Wall fell. You see how those two countries had a very different starting point. Of course, the Polish economy, GDP per capita, was comparable to the Bulgarian economy, and so on and so forth, but the political scene was very different. The second thing that was different, and it's a domestic political factor that came to play, was that there was no strong counter-elite capable to organizing itself and claiming power in either country. The first democratic elections in 1990 in both countries were won by the former regime, pretty much. In Romania, it was less competitive. The opposition was weaker. I think in Bulgaria, it was closer race. But nonetheless, the common trend and the common pattern applied. So if in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, in Poland, you had the new anti-communist forces taking power, in Bulgaria and Romania, that didn't quite happen. So there was this initial period of competition, fighting, and there was no consensus on the kind of domestic reforms, especially in the economy, that would secure the environment to make it easier for the EU to engage. That happened much later in the late 90s. So we can speak about 5-6 years left in this crucial period, missed at the time when the Central Europeans went through the initial steps of institutional and economic reform. Then, of course, those old elites that stayed in power, but also the new anti-communist parties, they shared something in common. And what they clear were in favor of EU membership. So that's something that defined Bulgaria and Romania from very early on, the pro-European consensus. And I'll say that even now, the consensus is very strong. If you look at any polling data, you see great substantial majorities in both countries at the societal level supportive of EU membership. So there is no Euroscepticism playing a huge part, for obvious reasons, if you do the maths and see how people are taking benefit from free movement, but also the economic opportunities opened by membership. And that's something that started in the early 90s. In other words, both former communists and anti-communist opposition, which actually came to govern Bulgaria for a tiny bit of time in the early 90s, were in favor of EU membership. And they made a very crucial step in 1993 when they managed to sign an association agreement. Those association agreements at the time were not guaranteeing membership because the EU was still not decided whether the whole exercise was about accession or about something else. A bit like now, there were debates about alternative forms of integration. So when I listened to Emmanuel Macron, I remember the old days under François Mitterrand, but even Jacques Chirac, who played with those ideas. But that was a crucial political step because ultimately those two countries at the end of the queue managed to jump on the bandwagon with the more advanced states in Central Europe, and to close a little bit the gap. Then what happened, again, the turning point was, as I said before, the mid-1990s. In 96, in Romania, there was the opposition coming to power for the first time. And likewise in Bulgaria, there was a Union of Democratic Forces government brought in power by early elections that were preceded by a huge shock. There was hyperinflation crisis and a total political and societal meltdown, a bit reminiscent of what happened in Albania in 1997 with the pyramid scheme collapse. So Bulgaria had a similar moment with, of course, some national peculiarities. Hyperinflation is no fun, especially in the middle of the winter. But that was a momentous event that changed the political dynamic in Bulgaria, and then installed a pro-European government that started to making a very strong case for both the EU, but also NATO. Just to open the parenthesis, in Romania, NATO was always a priority for everyone because of geopolitics, but also historical experience. In Bulgaria, it was a divisive issue in the 1990s with the former communists not being committed to it. But what I wanted to say is that by the end of the 90s, consensus was there. You had reformist governments in both places. In Bulgaria, the reforms, and by reforms I mean, first and foremost, privatization, the change of economic structure, were moving forward. In Romania, it was much more difficult because of the coalition structure of the government, but also the presence of various veto actors, for example, the miners, who were a disruptive force and intervened in politics on multiple occasions. But the direction was very clear. And one date that made a huge difference, and this is where Albania is right now, was the end of 1999. That was the moment, the Helsinki Council, when the EU decided to open membership negotiations. And that was not an easy decision, because the European Commission at the time had judged Bulgaria and Romania not to be prepared enough. So the European Commission was much more reticent about it. And that was an issue because in 2 years before, in 1997, the front runners, including Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, Hungary, and Estonia, cleared that threshold. So they had started membership negotiations. Bulgaria and Romania were told to wait, along with Lithuania and Latvia. And in 1999, the Commission was in favor of Latvia and Lithuania, had second thoughts about Bulgaria and Romania. What changed the dynamic was the member states. There was a clear understanding that enlargement was not just a technical exercise, but also a political project. You remember the summer of 1999 in spring, during the NATO campaign in Kosovo, Bulgaria and Romania joined NATO. Public opinion was very hostile, but the governments kind of pushed the decision because they saw that they had to be on the side of the West. And the decision to open negotiations was in part a payback or payoff this decision. Tony Blair played a role at the time because he lobbied clearly. He visited Bucharest and Sofia at the time, as did Bill Clinton, by the way, as a sign of recognition for what those two countries did at the time. But it's not our task here to go into the Yugoslav crisis and its implications. Just wanted to highlight this theme that member states and politics very often weighed in. And on this occasion, it was for the better, because they tipped the balance in favor of opening negotiations and persuaded the Germans to go that route as well. Now it's very different, of course. Fast forward to today, because the constellation in the EU Council is very different. UK is not there anymore. And remember, in the 1990s, the UK was consistently lobbying for enlargement. Skeptics were saying the Brits are doing it because they don't want a strong EU. They want more members to make the EU more diverse and unwieldy. But that's probably only one interpretation. I think with the Blair administration, there was a clear strategic vision of using enlargement as a geopolitical tool to stabilize the EU's periphery. Now, with the French and the Germans in the driving seat, the priority of internal consolidation is much more visible, much more salient, and this geopolitical expansion as stabilization has lost much of its currency. I close the parenthesis if you compare 1999 and 2000. So further to my story, then starting from 2000 to 2004, essentially with Romania and Bulgaria, you had the period of negotiations, and Albania is right now there. I mean, hopefully now, yesterday you had the negotiation framework, now hopefully a date, but once the accession talks kick in, that's the time when the EU has greatest amount of leverage. But again, leverage is very differential, because in some areas EU has standards and competences, say in internal market matters, in agricultural policy, in to some degree monetary policy. So you have areas with great number, great volume of EU acquis. And then you have other areas where the EU was learning on the job. For example, judicial reform would stand out. For the simple reason that EU is not doing judiciaries. When it was established in the 50s and then expanded into various Western European countries, it contained countries with reasonably well-functioning judicial systems, so the EU intervention was not needed, and there was a business left to the member states. Also, it's a matter of national sovereignty. But then you have two countries in Southeast Europe where actually they need both strong pressure to reform in those areas. But what are the common standards? What do you want to tell them, given that you don't have a set of common standards beyond that? Actually, judges, magistrates have to do their job, not to be corrupt, and not to be beholden to special interests, and so on and so forth. So that's the thing. The chapter was open at some point and closed at another point. There was the understanding that there was business left unfinished, and then unfinished business was left after membership. And I don't think we went very far on this one. I'll then go back into this issue later on in the second part of my talk. But let's flag up this idea that in some areas EU had a great amount of resources, know-how, and the standards that it could push countries to comply with. In other areas, it was developing common standards, and some areas were overlooked. Again, remember media. There was precious little about media and what to do. And again, this is something crucial for the whole democratic regime. And I would say the rule of law to function, because there are all kinds of linkages and connections between civil society, the judiciary, rule of law, and the free media in a non-consolidated democracy. Negotiations finished in 2004, pretty much, and then those two countries signed membership accession treaties in 2005. Now, the accession treaties were interesting because they had these two options on paper. One was that the two countries had to wait until 2008 for 3 years and be monitored in the interim, and join without any additional monitoring, without the cooperation verification mechanism. Or they could join in 2007, but with CVM. And ultimately, those two decided to go for the earlier date, which was probably rational from the point of view of the governments at the time. We shouldn't forget that 2008 was the time of economic crisis, so political scene in Europe changed dramatically that year. But the downside is that they joined, and you could argue they joined in a special category of their own, second class, because of the continued monitoring. But citizens didn't necessarily see monitoring as something bad, so that was not the perception that is humiliating. On the contrary, EU in both countries was long seen, maybe not as much now, but clearly in those days, as a corrective to the national level of governance, that Bulgarian and Romanian institutions are not trustworthy, and therefore they could be held accountable, if not by the citizens, but by the European Commission and European level structures. A lot of people in Europe talk about democratic deficits, that the European level is not accountable, not transparent, not democratic. But here the democratic deficit was reversed, that the national level was not seen as accountable enough and burdened by corruption. And therefore Europe was there to compensate for that. And that's something that to some degree applies also in the Western Balkans. Certainly, I think in Albania, where trust in all pro-Western and trust in Western institutions is higher than other parts of the region, especially in former Yugoslavia. So the process pretty much ended in 2007. Now, throughout this period, you had various governments in power in both Romania and Bulgaria. In Romania in 2000, the former Communist Party, the left-wing Social Democrats, came back to power, and they held it pretty much until 2004, when you had a coalition government. In Bulgaria, populism kicked in. So remember the UDF, the Union of Democratic Forces, which secured negotiations and sided with the West in Kosovo. They were demolished in 2000, and because a new populist force headed by the former king of Bulgaria came on the scene, and they kind of had a landslide victory. But without going deeper into domestic politics and who was in charge when, what is important to say is that all those years, you had the consensus pretty much in place. So whatever government was there, populist, left-wing, right-wing, coalition, they subscribed to the idea of EU membership. It was the golden rule in both countries. The issue, though, is what they, and by they I mean politicians, governments, and leaders expected from the EU. Certainly in many areas, I think they played lip service. So they wanted to do the absolute minimum to clear the hurdles, to close the chapter, to open a chapter, to get the benefits, but without doing the deep reforms that probably could have cost them power and resources. So the cost-benefit analysis, they could actually make progress without undermining their base, and that's how it works. Maintaining the balance was pretty important, and that's one lesson learned for the EU, that the EU is a contributing factor, but it cannot substitute for domestic political will to change political systems and to take on corruption. In Romania, the reforms and this is my way of transitioning to the second part of the paper, what has worked and what hasn't worked. If you look at the fight against corruption and the EU conditionality, in Romania, the model of national governance was very different from that in Bulgaria. There was political space to establish a really powerful office of the independent anti-corruption prosecutor, and to empower it to pursue high-level corruption. First with Monica Macovei, who was ally of the president, so she had domestic support, and later on with Laura Kövesi, much later, who is now the head of a new EU institution dealing with the rule of law, so she'd be somebody relevant to the Albanian case. But the judiciary in Bulgaria has a very different structure and very different history from judiciary in Romania. So in Romania, the problem was that the judiciary was under too much political control. The Minister of Justice was there at the top of the whole structure of public prosecutors. So that the problem was too much political interference in the judiciary. In the Bulgarian case, from very early on, and as the constitutional model adopted in 1991, the judiciary is separate. It's a very separate branch. But the downside is that it's not accountable, right? So there's no way to pressure them, but also there's no way to hold them accountable for breaking the law. And that applies not that much to judges, but to prosecutors. In many countries, prosecutors are part of the executive. In Bulgaria, the prosecutorial sub-branch is part of the judiciary, which is maybe a good thing in some circumstances. But if you have the Soviet system of a very hierarchical prosecutorial branch with the chief prosecutor there for 7 years, so this is somebody who could outlast any prime minister, any elected politician, and they have precious little means to control them, or him, because there hasn't been a lady. It's always a guy at the top of the system. And when any prosecutor in this pyramid of power could be replaced at any point in an investigation by the prosecutor general, so this is the person who controls everything in the system, then we have a problem, because the moment he is appointed, he becomes a critical political player and can enter into all kinds of deals with political parties, with other players. There is no way, or very difficult to replace him or to hold him accountable by Parliament. So you could ask, so how did the EU swallow that? Well, they didn't. I mean, that was clearly an issue, and they saw the downsides of the Bulgarian system of a very independent but unaccountable judiciary and prosecutors. They tried to force some reform, maybe bring the prosecution back under the executive to ensure some sort of a public scrutiny by that. But then the Constitutional Court stepped in and managed to block any decisions, saying that it's a part of the constitutional structure of the country. So to change the model, you had to go through a very difficult procedure to convene a special parliament with more members and so on and so forth. Make it nearly impossible. So that's one lesson learned. EU pressure has to be, first of all, much based on some sort of a shared understanding of what the standard is, what the EU wants to achieve, but also it's very much dependent on the presence of veto players. In the Romanian case, there were no powerful veto players in the judiciary to obstruct the creation of the special prosecutor, who also had the political mandate. In the Bulgarian system, there were powerful domestic players who blocked any reform at the point in 2003, 2004, when the EU was at the peak of its powers. And basically left this question undecided, put it off, deferred it for later, and we are still living with the consequences right now. We can discuss in the Q&A how this is playing out right now in Bulgaria, the prosecutor general. But when the EU had the opportunity to make a difference, it was blocked, and it left the follow-up reforms because the decision of the Constitutional Court left some space for reforms for after membership. And there were some cosmetic reforms, but I don't think they make a huge amount of difference. So in Romania, you didn't have this kind of domestic constellation. In Bulgaria, had a very specific domestic constellation that diluted EU's influence and basically foreclosed this opportunity for institutional change. In the economic realm, by contrast, where I would say things worked, you didn't have as many blocking veto actors. The privatization that was pretty much a condition for Europeanization and market reform process. Again, part of the one hurdle along the way was granting Romania and Bulgaria the status of functioning market economy. That's in the Copenhagen criteria. That was accepted, and those clientelistic veto players that could have blocked the process in the 1990s pretty much adapted to the new system and took part in the privatization. And ultimately, the state economies were dismantled, with some exceptions, of course. For example, the energy sector, which is a universe of its own, where the state plays a role. But there was a consensus. There were no veto actors on the issue of market reform, and people, oligarchic structures, but also businesses went along the flow and adapted to the new situation. And the EU acquis was pretty much taken aboard without a great deal of disruption. So the combination of clear standards and very robust EU law plus more receptive domestic situation made it possible. It's much more problematic after membership, and that's the experience not just in Bulgaria and Romania, but of the whole region, because one key aspect of the EU, something that all those countries and their politicians really like, is the massive transfer of EU funds through cohesion policy, but also the common agricultural policy. So the flow of EU money has actually made a huge difference because in the Romanian and the Bulgarian case, and I'm going beyond membership, beyond 2007, this money kicked in right at the time of economic slump. Remember the big recession after the financial meltdown in 2008. So 2009, 2010, we are talking about an economic slowdown. So without the EU money, those economies could have been in a much worse shape. EU money helped it continue forward. And we are talking about billions. These are very important transfers, and not comparable to what the Western Balkans, including Albania, is getting under the EU financial assistance. The downside of these transfers is that they often fuel political corruption, because the money is distributed not very transparently, domestically, and they're channeled to those businesses that are close to whoever happens to be in government, and their way of politicians and oligarchs profiting from that. And that's not a Balkan phenomenon or Eastern European phenomenon. You have it also in Southern Europe. It's very much down to the kind of governance system. But what I wanted to say is that there are voices in Bulgaria, certainly, arguing that these transfers are a double-edged sword. They're helpful, but also they create a political problem because they crowd out more productive investment, but also are the kind of fodder that keeps political corruption alive and distorts the political system to the extent that it threatens democratic gains. So that's what worked, what hasn't worked. What are the lessons learned? My last part in the paper. Well, the lessons learned are that, first of all, you should think about veto actors. Who are they? What are their priorities? How do you outflank them? Second of all, is that domestic coalitions matter. I mean, what decides whether the EU works or doesn't work, in my opinion at least, is not whether the EU has adopted this or that document, but whether there is a domestic momentum to take on board the EU and push for change in this or that area. That's where you guys are relevant. If civil society has identified some priorities and is pushing for reform, say pass a new law on making media ownership transparent, or making state aid to the energy sector transparent. So the EU can only reinforce those coalitions, but it cannot solve those public policy and good governance issues by itself unless there is a sustained pressure from specialized communities and especially civil society and the free media sector on governance. And that's not an easy feat because, again, that's the third lessons learned. The initial conditions in our countries are very difficult because of the tradition of corruption in high places, of captured state, and of the way power is exercised and public resources are thought about by both elites and society at large. So to cut a long story short, I think the Romanian and Bulgarian experience offers a cautionary tale. But again, my message is not to dismiss those two countries and say they are failures. In fact, I think many things did work. Its picture is much more mixed, and I think that's the message I'm trying to convey with the paper. So thanks for your attention. Let's get some questions maybe.
Thank you, Dimitar. It was very interesting and thorough, the whole presentation. Of course, we will distribute the paper in the end of all the sessions, in the end of July, and all the participants and more can relate to that and to go into more details. I will now pass to the questions. We have also the translation working, so it is in the channel called German, because there is no Albanian, so we have to use German instead of Albanian. But now the floor is open. I also have a couple of questions, but I will leave the floor first to the participants, and then I will jump in. Please. You can also use the chat, writing in English or in Albanian for the questions.
Lady?
Oh, to the join.
Përshëndetje të gjithëve, unë jam Erida Zenele.
Well, hello everyone. My name is Erida Zenele. I come from the Parliament. As a matter of fact, I've got a question for the experts, and I can ask that question in English as well.
The civil society into the process, how they have been engaged through negotiations, how have you motivated them to give inputs about negotiation process?
Sorry, Elda, we missed the part, the first part, because it started in Albanian. Then. Could you repeat it?
How have they engaged the civil society to participate in negotiation process? How have they motivated their participation?
Sorry, shall we take more questions or come back to this one right away?
Okay, yeah, okay, we take a couple of questions.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, we have. Okay. Okay, we have 3 questions in the chat already from Anissa. Thank you.
All right, I can see the 3 questions as well. I think that's more than enough. Let's let me have a round now. I don't think there was a sustained effort in 2000 to engage civil society in the negotiations, because much of the negotiation was on very technical issues, say state assistance, state aid, or anti-competition, anti-monopoly competition policy. There were probably some experts, but those issues were not very salient at the time. It's not that civil society cared that much. Secondly, what counted as civil society 20 years ago is very different from what counts as civil society now. Remember, that was before social media, before internet was so widespread. I mean, there was the internet, of course, but it was email, essentially, not Facebook and Twitter and the whole shebang. So what I wanted to say is that they were a couple of specialized civil society organizations that were probably involved, were consulted, but it was not a decisive experience. First, because of the technical nature. So society at large didn't really care about the substance of the negotiations. It was not very salient. And secondly of all, the way negotiations are structured. So the words negotiation is a bit of a misnomer, and it relates to the other questions. It's not that you're sitting down with the EU and you're negotiating the substance of the EU conditions. It's mostly the EU setting the requirements, and then you're reporting what you have done to meet the requirements, and maybe you are trying to set some transition periods on when the EU standards, laws will become effective in your national legislation. So it's a very top-down process, and it's not much space for civil society to inject some substance on it. And again, much of what civil society cared about was beyond the remit of the EU. Maybe it was part of the political conditions monitoring, but not, strictly speaking, negotiations. For example, in Romania in 2004-2005, there was the Coalition for Clean Parliament. In other words, a coalition of NGOs gathered together to vet all the lists of party members who are running and then publish data on their corruption dealings, on suspicions, and have a public vetting process. But I don't think that was part of the negotiation process. That was a parallel undertaking. And of course, the delegation in Bucharest and the commission, the enlargement commissioner took account of that and was then reflected in the reports. And because the reports highlighted issues, politicians faced some pressure through the reports and the reporting process, but it was not in the negotiations. So it's again a mixed picture. Did the civil society participate? Not really. Did they play a role? They did play a role, obviously, because when commission officials were putting together the annual monitoring reports, they listened to civil society and they reflected civil society initiatives. But I'd say, again, going back to these days, civil society in both countries is a bit more robust, but it's not because of the EU, it's probably even despite it, because civil society, especially in big cities, is rooted in the understanding that EU is a great thing, but it's not enough to reform those countries. So the frustration that the accession process hasn't delivered to the extent we expected has highlighted the need for civic action. That you need to push governments not to undermine the environmental legislation and to stick to EU norms, because left to their own resources, the governments will bypass, will kind of try to outsmart the European Commission and so on and so forth. But going back to your question, I don't think civil society was that critical to the negotiations. They were critical to parts of the accession process, but not necessarily the technical negotiations. Now let me go to the questions. So about Northern Macedonia and Albania being on the verge of the first intergovernmental conference. Yeah, I mean, let's see how the Council responds to the framework mandate and the framework negotiation position by the Commission. Again, Germany is in a bit of a bind because it has a bigger fish to fry. Domestic consolidation has become a big issue now. Enlargement is not such a priority. And when Emmanuel Macron says, let's leave those issues, let's not speed up the process, but slow it down as much as possible, because we have to be focused internally. I think Germany has lesser capacity to push back. But it's, at least at this point, it's important to have a date, because it's been almost 3 years of waiting for the decision and the opening of the accession talks, and that breeds frustration. So I'm hopeful that there will be some decision. But the point is that as analysts, as activists, civil society, we often so much fixated on those symbolic dates. I think what's much more important is substance, issue by issue. Where does the EU make a difference? So opening negotiations is great, but do we think that there will be positive change in this or that area? And how does the opening negotiation changes the power dynamic domestically? I think that's the issue we should be looking at. So there's a question later on about Russian influence and the pandemic. Well, I don't think the pandemic makes a huge amount of difference with regard to Russian influence. Russia delivered some assistance to Serbia and also to Republika Srpska, and tried to also send assistance to Mostar in the Federation. But it did so partly to meet the expectation and partly to be relevant as China, because China stepped in early and also Turkey was involved. But these are symbolic gestures. They don't testify to some sort of reinforced Russian interest in the region. if you do the maths, you see the massive package the EU has put on the table with recovery money. And of course, there are a lot of questions and footnotes on this money. But the bottom line is that Russia is not paying for the region's recovery. It doesn't have the firepower. It doesn't have the political will to support. And it's no replacement for the EU. Even China has stolen the show because it has a narrative to promote, not just in the Balkans, but across the globe. That China was first afflicted by the pandemic, but was successful overcoming it. And now it's providing its know-how, but also resources to everyone around the world. Russia doesn't have a positive story to tell because it's still in the midst of the pandemic. So it's not a crucial turning point. Though, I mean, of course, Russia traditionally uses humanitarian assistance to score points. The example would be 2014 with the floods in the region when they sent emergency assistance and teams to Serbia, again, Republika Srpska, and that produced a huge amount of PR. Some of you might remember those political surveys in Serbia, where a majority of people is singling out Russia as a donor equal to the EU, which is not the case. I mean, Russia is far, far behind even countries like Japan or Canada in terms of financial assistance. And now, of course, everyone in Serbia believes that China is a top donor to their country, which again is not the case. EU is by far the most important economic, but also developmental assistance provider. It's just that in some Balkan countries, that it's not reflected in the media. And the question is, why is that the case? Why do media owners, journalists, but also politicians not willing to give EU credit and giving too much credit to other players like China, Russia, and so on and so forth? So the current situation in Kosovo, how the future of Kosovo, again, it's very difficult to say. I mean, everybody's in a wait and see situation now that the meeting in Washington failed. President Taci is in a bind. Of course, the judge hasn't confirmed the allegations, and we don't know much about the allegations themselves, the substance. And we have very scant details. But he's been undermined, and he doesn't have the political capital to negotiate right now, which puts Serbia in a very comfortable position because Vučić just won in the elections. He has a very plausible story to tell Western leaders that he's open to negotiate, he's constructive, but there is nobody really in Pristina to talk to because it's in disarray. And that relieves pressure on Serbia. And Kosovar citizens are paying the bill because, first of all, they've been victimized by the EU without visa-free travel, put under pressure by Serbia, and ultimately their elites, their political scene is in disarray. So I think they're the losers in this situation, which brings the EU back into the picture because it's high time that they put their act together and try to restart the normalization talks. US is really important, but you cannot count on the US, especially in pre-election times. The EU officials, high representative for foreign security policy, but also the envoy to the Balkans, Miroslav Lajčák, have to get their act together and try to restart the process. But also the EU has to make a move on visa-free travel because it doesn't make any sense to keep Kosovo away. What were the specific steps that Romania and Bulgaria achieved to be part of the EU? Well, the specific steps was, again, overhauling the economy, changing the economic structure, going through a period of growth. Remember, their negotiations coincided in the 2000s with the period of expansion in the global economy, also in Europe, which paid off dramatically in those two countries. Right in the middle of the economic reform of privatization, you have a big upswing, billions and billions of foreign direct investment. If you look at Bulgaria right now, the FDI that is coming to the country is nowhere near what we used to receive back then, because of the global conditions, but because of the demand in Bulgaria. So the dynamic economic changes and the economic success of those two countries back in that time was something that they did deliver to the EU. Again, if you compared Bulgaria and Romania in 2004 to Bulgaria and Romania in 1994, there was a sea change. In the 90s, those two countries went through periodic economic shocks, lack of reform, disruption, delayed institutional changes. In the 2000s, the elites were probably reluctant to change the judiciaries, reluctant to tackle corruption, but they showed very strong commitment to comply with much of the European Union law on the economy and to transform it as much as possible. So that was clearly something they did deliver back then, which strengthened their case. So any European bureaucrat in the mid-2000s would say these are economic hopeful stories, and the businesses, European business likes them and is eager to give them credit to invest there. Especially, I mean, Romania has an automotive sector that has been very resilient to this day. Renault set up a factory there, which was meant for the local market, and it proved to be a success across Europe. The export of those models assembled and manufactured in Romania. Likewise, Bulgaria became integrated into various manufacturing supply chains in Europe. So these are concrete successes at the very basic level that strengthened their case, that European businesses were giving them credit. What the EU, of course, was not very convinced, and rightly so, was the depth of institutional reform. But even there, remember, Romania managed to charge a former prime minister. So the guy under whom the initial negotiations were conducted, Adrian Nastase, ended up in jail. Cynics would say that's because of a political vendetta. But as you see in the paper, the people established a special prosecutor in Romania, who ultimately came to serve well, which is a good story. It's a positive story that it was not a partisan institution at the end of the day. President Băsescu provided the political backing for Monica Macovei, helped her establish the independent prosecutor, only to see later on that his brother was sent to jail and sentenced. So Romania, beyond the economy, also had a positive story on the rule of law. And protests now in Romania started when the government tried to undermine this institution, to close it even. And civil society mobilized to protect something that the EU had helped establish. So this testifies that Europeanization did happen in the sense that it created a political dynamic from the bottom up, at least in Romania. So what other questions do you have? Youth activism and engagement, policy making decision. I don't think they made a difference for the start of the negotiations in Bulgaria and Romania. That was a very political process. Again, in the late 90s, civil society was very different, as I said. There was a consensus in the country. But also, the missing piece was not in those two countries. Their politicians were committed to start negotiations very soon. It was a national priority in both Sofia and Bucharest. What was missing was political will in Europe. And I think the Kosovo war may tip the balance. Another hurdle, by the way, was, and it's something that Albania also went through a decade ago. Bulgaria and Romania, unlike the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, and so on, they were excluded from Schengen, visa-free travel. So we had visas, as you guys did, until 2001. So lifting the visas and implementing all the reforms, say with asylum policy, with new passports, with databases, and so on and so forth, was a priority because there was a huge demand for that. And the moment that hurdle was cleared, first for Bulgaria and several months later for Romania, that was a crucial moment of where EU integration delivered. It made a tremendous difference for people like me who traveled at the time, because, as you know, I mean, applying for a Schengen visa was no fun, especially in the 90s. So there was this payoff. But again, what I wanted to say is that it's not youth activism or civil society which was decided. It was decisive for Bulgarian and Romanian politicians and civil servants to convince their European counterparts that they have the commitment and they have done their homework, and they'll implement the conditions, especially the technical conditions, and they can be trusted. And they made a strong case back then because there was the commitment. The problem is that once you become a member, it's much more difficult to motivate and to push those national policymakers, decision makers, to implement such policies. These were the golden days of European integration because the EU had so much power to influence domestic politicians. I mean, everybody would wait for the reports on the kind of the progress report, and people will use it in parliament. There will be op-eds in newspapers, and that was a major political event. And that's not the case, hasn't been the case with the cooperation verification mechanism reports that came later on. Sorry if I didn't answer your question because there's so many threads to it. What were the strategies followed by Romania and Bulgaria in the foreign policy and accession process? So that's a very good one, because when governments were making their case to the EU, one part of the message was that we are not only committed to do the homework and to reform, with all caveats. I mean, how much they did that is an open question, but the second part was that we will be also helping our neighbors Europeanize. We will be bringing EU, but also NATO to the neighborhood. Romania was very keen on that. In 2004, under President Basescu, it launched this Black Sea Forum. Again, that was the time of the colored revolution. So Georgia, Ukraine, but also Moldova, which is very important for the Romanians. So Romania wanted to talk up its credentials as an exporter of Western influence to the Black Sea area. And to some degree, Bulgaria was in this game as well. So in 2007, one of their first initiatives was to produce a commission paper called Black Sea Synergy. But I'm not sure how much that made a difference beyond shaping discourse in European institutions. Maybe not that much, but ultimately EU, Bulgaria and Romania wanted to portray themselves as not just recipients of EU, but also constructive players within the EU. Russia was an issue, of course, but you should remember that in the 2000s, and especially in the case with Bulgaria, which restarted its cooperation with Russia around that time with big energy projects. Russia was not such a divisive issue in the EU back at that time during the negotiations, because there were member states who were very critical of Russia, especially after 2004 when Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, but also Poland joined. But there were others like Italy, Greece, also Germany to some degree, who favored a very engagement with the Russians. And Putin was seen as somebody who could be partnered with. So Bulgaria didn't stand out. It could very credibly make the argument that EU membership and NATO membership is not incompatible with cooperation with Russia. So that was part of Bulgarian foreign policy at the time. If Romania was much more confrontational vis-a-vis the Russians and wanted to extend NATO in the Black Sea, Bulgaria wanted to combine Western integration with cooperation with Russia. So they had very different foreign policy, very different foreign policies at the time. That's 15 years ago. Why Bulgaria and Romania are not part of Schengen? That's a very good question as well. Well, both Bulgaria and Romania have met the technical conditions for Schengen. And that's something that's both the Commission, but also I think the Council has agreed on. The crucial difference was that in 2011, 2012, the other member states, those in Schengen, decided to make a linkage. So link Schengen membership with cooperation verification mechanism, reform of the judiciary, and anti-corruption and organized crime in Bulgaria. That was probably a smart decision at the time, because you want to maximize your leverage and use Schengen as a way to get more cooperation from governments in Bucharest and Sofia. But unfortunately, it worked the other way around, because of those conditions, making it much more difficult to enter Schengen, I think both countries decided it's not worth it, because much of what Schengen offers is they already have it. If, for instance, Bulgaria has this one Schengen land frontier with Greece. If you want to go to Greece, of course, there's border controls. But there's just one passport check. It's either your passport is checked by the Bulgarians or by the Greeks, just by one policeman. You don't have multiple checks on both ends of the border. So it's pretty easy to cross. It's not a big deal. If you want to fly into Schengen, you have to go through a different terminal usually, but it's not such a big hassle. So I think what happened in 2011 to 2012 with linkages, government just decided it's not worth the effort to go into those deep judicial reforms, because Schengen is not a big reward. It's not a sufficient reward. Now, in the Bulgarian case, what is much more important, in my view, and it's still topical right now, it's not Schengen, but it's Eurozone membership. Because Bulgaria and Romania find themselves very different places with monetary policy. Since 1997, and because of the hyperinflation crisis in Bulgaria, the national currency has been pegged first to the German mark and later on to the euro. In other words, Bulgaria has no monetary policy. It's part of the ECB, part of the Eurozone de facto, without the benefits of Eurozone membership, for instance, low interest rates. So it makes a huge sense for the Bulgarians to abandon the national currency and to join the euro sooner rather than later. It's just that it's proven very difficult with a lot of opposition at the political level, especially during the Eurozone crisis, to allow Bulgaria to enter in the waiting room for the Eurozone. And right now we might be there. So that's the next step of integration. It has all kinds of economic but also political implications, because at the end of the day, the Eurozone is the true EU, where decisions are taken but also resources are concentrated. And if you are Bulgaria, you rather want to be part of the Eurozone and not outside it. For a country like Romania, but also Poland and others who have their independent monetary policies, the cost and benefit analysis might be a bit different. But for the Bulgarians, it's a clear priority to be in the Eurozone. And it's an interesting question why the governments in Sofia for a decade used to put it on the agenda, then walk back and then put it again. But it seems that this time it is real, that they're ready to make a sustained case why they should go into the waiting room. For those of you who don't know, the process of joining the euro is that you have to be allowed into something called European rate mechanisms. You get there, you stay for a couple of years, and then your public finances are monitored. You have to maintain a certain percentage of budget deficit, of public debt, and so on and so forth. But once you get into the waiting room, it's a technical process. If you tick the boxes, then you're in the Eurozone. That's what happened in the Baltic countries. But entering into the waiting room is a political decision. So Bulgaria has to right now convince France, Germany, the Netherlands, and the rest that it's in a good shape and it can be trusted to become part of the common currency. But for the Bulgarians, it makes a huge amount of political and economic sense to be in the Eurozone right now. What do you think about judiciary reform in Albania and the rumors that it can be applied? Well, I haven't looked deep into the judicial reform in Albania, because you guys know much more about the ins and outs of the process and the details. It seems to me that the EU is trying to, of course, with this vetting scheme, to make sure that the magistrates are accountable and there are certain political and professional standards they have to meet. But at the risk of sounding very general and preachy, probably, I must say that the judiciary, it's not a random decision to focus on judicial reform in Albania or in the Western Balkans. The fact that the EU does that is partly lessons learned from Bulgaria and Romania, where it didn't quite perform the way it did. Judiciary is critical to, first of all, the sense of fairness in society, but also to level playing field in the economy, and also the rule of law more generally. Without a functioning judiciary, basically all the democratic achievements you have might really be reversed, because state capture becomes much more prevalent. Again, what my sense is that the EU has the right instinct and is doing everything right in terms of applying pressure throughout for judicial reform, but experience shows that the EU by itself cannot achieve much. And then this is where politicians, but also especially civil society, come into the picture. Without pressure from within a country, it's very difficult to foresee sustainable change, which goes on after negotiations are over and after membership is hopefully achieved. Very often, without this domestic momentum, those changes appear to be very superficial, not to say Potemkin villages. And that's my fear for Western Balkans, that right now the EU is making progress because politicians and governments want to meet the conditions, but the moment pressure is relaxed, there's serious backsliding. All right.
Okay, so it looks like no more questions. Thank you, Dimitar. It was very empenyative. We had a lot of issues to raise with you, not only because of the situation in Albania, but also in the European Union.
Yeah.
And more, as you mentioned, there are more uncertainties now that were before. It was much straightforward, the process at the time that it is now.
Sure.
But still, let's say we get our lessons, we have to do our homework, and then see what happened at the European level. The Balkans are, let's say, a mix of small countries, so it's very difficult to have a foreign policy when it comes to European Union, or to include the foreign policy in the accession process. So it's very difficult. We have very few spaces, let's say, and one of the issues which have been raised many times has been that our politicians in the Balkans often play the card of stability, which doesn't always pays back. And I think that we should have more focus in the strengthening of our institutions and gradually building the democratic culture that we are lacking in the institution and society in general. Still, I'd like to thank you again. It was longer than we expected, but it was very interesting, and I hope that all the participants will enjoy the paper when we send to them. We have all the emails address, so we will for sure send the paper so they can have more insights on the issues that you thoroughly discussed. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for the attention.
Thank
you. All the best.
Bye.
Bye. Atëherë, sipas agjendës, ne do të vazhdojmë shkurtimisht me pjesën e mbetur. Do përpiqemi ta shkurtojmë, duke qenë se kemi pasur pak vonesa në fillim për shkak të çështjeve teknike, por kjo pjesë do jetë vetëm në shqip, pra nuk ka përkthim. Do të bëjmë, kolegja ime Anita Lushi do të bëjë një prezantim të një pjese të studimit, të surveyit që ne kemi bërë. Ne në secilën nga webinaret gjatë këtij muaji do të paraqesim disa nga çështjet që janë trajtuar në këtë pyetësor dhe një analizë e të dhënave të dala. Kjo më shumë për të ngacmuar debat, po dhe në fund për të bërë një përmbledhje të gjithë gjetjeve, dhe jemi përpjekur gjithashtu të krahasojmë edhe me pyetësor të ndryshëm apo survey të tjerë që bëhen aktualisht. Nuk do ndalem shumë, duke ditur për mos të ngrënë shumë kohë, do përpiqemi brenda 5 deri 7 minutave të bëjmë prezantimin dhe më pas nëse ka pyetje dhe do të përfundojmë webinarin për të vazhduar javës tjetër. Po jap fjalën koleges time, Anita Lushi.
Përshëndetje. Si që dhe Gledisi e tha, në këtë sesion, në këtë pjesë të webinarit, do fokusohemi tek disa nga gjetjet më pikante të studimit eksplorimi sfidave në perspektivën e europianizimit të Shqipërisë. Pikëpari do të përmendja sa i përket metodologjisë së këtij studimi. Është një studim i cili është përdorur teknika e Ortekut lidhur me intervistimin. Pyetjet kanë qenë pyetje të strukturuara, gjysmë të strukturuara dhe po ashtu pyetje të hapura. Intervistat janë zhvilluar ballë për ballë. Kemi pasur 100 të intervistuar për këtë studim. Dhe zonat nga të cilat të intervistuarit tanë kanë qenë janë Tirana, Vlora, Saranda, Gjirokastra, Elbasani dhe Durrësi. Dhe pyetjet në total kanë qenë 25. Unë po e nis direkt duke u bërë share screen, në mënyrë që të mund të shohim. Okay. Spari, po nisim me gjetjen e parë, po e quajmë, sa i përket problemeve, problemi i parë dhe të dytë më të rëndësishëm me cilët vendi ynë po përballet sot. I hedhim një sy grafikut. Atëherë, fikim pjesën e problemeve të dyta më të rëndësishme për të parë vetëm problemin e parë më të rëndësishëm fillimisht. Si të shihet në grafiku, pika e parë, problemi i parë, cilit të intervistuarit tanë janë referuar si çështja më problematike me cilët përballet vendi ynë sot, është papunësia dhe varfëria, që ka marrë edhe pjesën dërmuese të përzgjedhjeve, si mund ta themi. E dyta është shteti ligjor i dobët, të rendit publik, kriminaliteti, rrezikshmërisë së ulët, pra kundravajtjet dhe ndan po të njëjtin pozicion me korrupsionin. Ndërkohë, e ndjekur nga krimi organizuar, cilësia e edukimit, garazh për politike dhe institucione të dobëta demokratike dhe zhvillimi ekonomik. Më pas vazhdon me pavarësinë e sistemit gjyqësor dhe largimin e trurit. Dhe ndër të fundit, për të qenë korrekt, është kujdesi shëndetësor dhe shërbimet sociale. Këto janë problematikat më kryesore që janë identifikuar. Ndërkohë, ajo çka vëm re është që lajmet e rreme nuk është përzgjedhur nga asnjë prej të intervistuarve si problemi më i rëndësishëm me cilën përballet vendi ynë sot. Nëse i hedhim një sy, problemi të dytë më të rëndësishëm. Problemi i dytë më i rëndësishëm, po ashtu nuk kemi disbalanca tepër të mëdha sa i pam edhe me problemin e parë. Pra, shohim që papunësia dhe varfëria vazhdojnë edhe mban vendin e parë. Po ashtu shteti ligjor i dobët dhe rendi publik, kriminaliteti, rrezikshmërisë së ulët janë në krye të tabelës. Korrupsioni dhe krimi organizuar mbajnë vendin e dytë, duke ndarë po të njëjtat përzgjedhje, dhe më pas ndjekur nga cilësia e edukimit dhe garazh për politike dhe institucione të dobëta demokratike, që në fakt garazh për politike ndan po të njëjtin pozicion për atë tretin me korrupsionin dhe krimin organizuar. Ndërkohë, dhe largimi i trurit bën pjesë ka po të njëjtat, ndan po të njëjtat shifra me të mosipërmet, duke u ndjekur nga pavarësia e sistemit gjyqësor, pas asaj kujdesin shëndetësor dhe shërbimet sociale dhe zhvillimin ekonomik. Ajo çfarë vëmë re këtu, lidhur me lajmet e rreme, është përzgjedhur 2 herë si problemi i dytë më i rëndësishëm. Ndërkohë, nëse i shohim të plot, e shohim grafikun e plot, dhe i referohemi po ashtu publikimit më të fundit që është bërë dhe nga barometri ballkanik lidhur me opinionet, sjelljet dhe opinionet e Ballkanit lidhur me problematikat më të rëndësishme që po përballet ky rajon momentalisht, shohim që kemi një përputhje, në fakt, lidhur me ato çka të intervistuarit tanë janë përgjigjur dhe po ashtu me ato çka të intervistuarit pra nga barometri ballkanik janë përgjigjur. Pra, shohim që papunësia, situata ekonomike, krimi dhe korrupsioni mbeten në krye të tabelës lidhur me shqetësimet më kryesore që has jo vetëm Shqipëria, por krejt rajoni, pra ne i ndajmë këto 4 problematikat me krejt rajonin. Ndërkohë ajo çka është specifike për Shqipërinë është që situata e papunësisë është përkon me shqetësimin më të lartë në rajon. Pra lidhur me papunësinë, Shqipëria është ai vend që ka shqetësimin më të lartë. Shqipëria po ashtu karakterizohet nga nivelet ndër më të larta në rajon sa i përket destabilitetit politik. Dhe shqetësimet primare lidhen po ashtu siç përmend me papunësinë dhe zhvillimin ekonomik. Ndërkohë, nëse ne shohim lidhjen mes faktorëve ekonomik dhe largimin e trurit, ne kemi një korrelacion shumë të fortë, pavarësisht se largimi i trurit është përzgjedhur më së shumti në si problematika e dytë më e rëndësishme e vendit tonë. Kjo lidhet drejt për drejti me faktorët ekonomik të përmendur më sipër dhe rikonfirmon shqetësimet e larta të intervistuarve tanë. Ndërkohë, Largimi i trurit mund të përmendim këtu edhe shifrat e nxjerra së fundi sa i përket vitit 2019 lidhur me lëvizjet migratore drejt Europës, nga rajoni i Ballkanit drejt Europës. Shqipëria faktikisht, për fat të keq do mund të thoshim, ka mbajtur shifrat rekord për vitin 2019 me rreth 20.000 të larguar drejt Europës, që ka qenë faktikisht dyfishi mesatare së vendeve të tjera ballkanike. Në fakt, gjithë rajoni Ballkanit, duke përjashtuar Shqipërinë, ka pasur diku tek 10.000 të larguar drejt Europës, ndërkohë që vetëm Shqipëria ka pasur 20.000 të larguar drejt Europës. Kalojmë tek pyetja e dytë. Në fakt, çështja e dytë, edhe kjo pikë lidhet me çështjet e brendshme të Shqipërisë që duhet të jenë prioritare për shtetin shqiptar në të ardhmen, që duhen adresuar. Pyetja faktikisht, siç edhe dallohet, është gati e njëjtë me pyetjen e parë, domethënë kategoritë e përgjigjeve janë të ngjashme, po me një ndryshim të vogël. Këtu kemi edhe një kategori të tjetër të shtuar, pra në rast se na kanë shpëtuar opsione që nuk janë listuar në këtë pyetje, pra siç dallohet është pyetje gjysmë e strukturuar, jemi përpjekur që t'i përfshim tek opsioni tjetër. Ndërkohë ajo që shohim me këtë grafik është që papunësia dhe varfëria dhe shteti ligjor i dobët, rendi publik dhe kriminaliteti i rrezikshmërisë së ulët kryesojnë sërish tabelën. Pra kanë marrë përgjigjet më dërmuese të intervistuarve tanë. Por ajo që vjen drejt tjetër është që kemi një zbutje faktikisht, nuk ka më një humner aq të madhe sa shihnim në pyetjen e parë në pyetjen e dytë. Pra kemi një zbutje të shifrave. Ndërkohë, ato që kanë lëvizur, pra problematikat që janë zgjedhur si më prioritare, që duhet të jenë prioritet i shtetit shqiptar, shohim. Pra, zhvillimi ekonomik është rritur. Ndërkohë në tabelën e parë, zhvillimin ekonomik e kishim drejt fundit tabelës, afër fundit tabelës. Po ashtu cilësia e edukimit është rritur. Pra, konsiderohet si një ndër çështjet që duhet jetë prioriteti i shtetit shqiptar. Shohim që krimi i organizuar ka rënë poshtë. Shohim po ashtu që gara e ashpër politike, shteti ligjor i dobët dhe korrupsioni qëndrojnë në po të njëjtat pozicione, me disa luhatje të vogla në shifra, por mbajnë po ato pozicione. Ndërkohë që e fundit do thosha është zhvillimi ekonomik që ka pasur një rritje goxha të lartë. Nëse e marrim gjithë këto dy grafik që ne pam deri tani, gjitha këto të dhëna, edhe nëse i shohim në lupën krahasimore me problematikat që vendet tashmë të anëtarësuara në BE, pra siç u përmendën Rumania dhe Bullgaria, kam pasur dhe problematikat me cilat ato janë përballur në periudhën para aderimit janë në mos të njëjtat, tmerrsisht të ngjashme me problematikat që vendi ynë dhe rajoni i Ballkanit po përballet dhe janë listuar si çështjet më kryesore për t'u adresuar pra në çështjen në periudhën e para aderimit. Ajo çka ne mund dalim në përfundim të kësaj që mund shkojmë drejt fundit edhe të prezantimit të këtyre gjetjeve, është që rruga e Shqipërisë nuk është rruga drejt aderimit në BE, nuk është e ndryshme, nuk ndryshon fort nga rruga që kanë ndjekur edhe shtetet e tjera. Dhe prandaj praktikat edhe shembujt e tjera nga rajoni janë tepër të vlefshme për të patur një ecuri sa më të shpejt drejt Bashkimit Europian. Okej, kemi pyetje. Atëherë, kampionimi, siç u përmend në fillim, ka qenë 100 të intervistuar, grup mosha e pjesëmarrjes, ne jemi referuar mbi 18 vjeç dhe kemi synuar në fakt profesionistët të sektoreve më të rëndësishme të Shqipërisë dhe kampionimi, atëherë intervistat kanë zënë vend, janë zhvilluar, nisur nga fundi i shkurtit, fillimi i marsit, edhe kanë përfunduar faktikisht diçka në prill dhe mesmesit prillit. Pra që do thoshim, kanë prekur edhe periudhën e pandemisë edhe japin një panoramë goxha më të plot. po do dërgohet me email, po do dërgohet me email në momentin kur do kem përfunduar sesionet e webinarit. Po, në fakt, listohet i fundit kujdesi shëndetësor, edhe kjo duhet parë në fakt edhe lidhur me faktorët e tjerë. Është i fundit, ndër të fundit i listuar vetëm me 3 zgjedhje, por ndërkohë shohim që problematikat e tjera janë tepër shumë, pra kemi një diapazon goxhat të gjerë problematikash edhe kjo çon edhe ndoshta mund të fusim këtu edhe perceptimin që ne si shoqëri kemi pasur për periudhën e pandemisë. Nuk po i futemi teorive konspirative, por që gjithë jemi ndjenjë domethënë se si edhe është trajtuar pandemia nga ana e shoqërisë shqiptare. Kështu që nuk do thosha që është shumë për t'u habitur kjo si gjetje. Okej, nëse nuk ka pyetje të tjera, unë po e mbyll këtu dhe fjala ka Lëvizja. Ju falenderoj.
Atëherë, ju falenderoj të gjithëve për pjesëmarrjen aktive dhe interesin e treguar. Ju kërkoj edhe një herë ndjesë në fillim u desh pak kosa të zgjidhim çështje teknike, por në seminarët e radhës sigurisht që do të jemi edhe më efektiv. Shumë shpejt do ju dërgojmë nesër, do ju dërgojmë agjendën e javës së ardhshme, pra për ata të cilët kanë interes, do të jetë një lektor i njohur grek i cili do trajtojë disa çështje që kanë të bëjnë që nga programet europiane të ndihmës, mundësitë për aplikime në fondet të Bashkimit Europian, ashtu si dhe për politika të ndryshme në nivel europian për të rinjt, aktivizmin, qytetarin që të cilat janë me interes për të gjithë ne. Shumë shpejt do vi emaili ku mund të çekoni pra në cilën nga apo në të gjitha nëse doni në 3 aktivitetet, 3 sesionet e radhës që do të jenë të martë, të enjte dhe të premte. Po ashtu do dërgojmë dhe agjendën e plot deri në fund muajit për 12 leksionet. Ju falenderoj edhe një herë për vëmendjen. Miru takofshim në webinarin e ardhshëm. Mirupafshim.
Faleminderit, mirupafshim.